Welcome to the Infrastructure Podcast. My name is Anthony Oliver, and today we're going to reflect on last year's HS2 North project cancellation and 1 year on explore what lessons might be learned for future major project deliveries as we move into the Starmer government era. Now, I've been writing about infrastructure projects for 30 years or so, and it seems when you look back, one consistent theme constantly crops up. The delivery of major infrastructure projects is troublesome, to say the least. And as an industry, we continuously overpromise when it comes to budgets and programme and underdeliver when it comes to social, economic and environmental outcomes. I'm thinking Jubilee Line Extension, Heathrow T5, Channel Tunnel Rail Link, Crossrail, all fantastic assets today, but the delivery process has left the industry's reputation in the eyes of the public and politicians, well, pretty much in tatters. In fact, according to the book How Big Things Get Done by Flyberg and Gardner, 99.5% of major projects worldwide are over budget, over time, and fail to deliver their expected benefits. So when Prime Minister Rishi Sunak announced to the Conservative Party conference in October 2023 that Phase 2 of the HS2 project beyond the West Midlands would be cancelled and replaced with Network North, a £36 billion hastily thrown together hodgepodge of transport projects, it was hardly a surprise. HS2, said Sunak, is a project whose costs have more than doubled, which has been repeatedly delayed and is not scheduled to reach Manchester for almost 2 decades, and for which the economic case has massively been weakened with the changes to business travel post-COVID. And I suppose the industry's reputation for deliveries was sent once again into the bin. I say again because this is not the first example of politically driven de-scoping as politicians run out of patience waiting for a ribbon to cut. The question is, why do they seem to have such troubled berths? It warrants deeper discussion. So therefore my pleasure to welcome Kay Hughes, former HS2 Design Director, and Andy Murray, Executive Director at the Major Projects Association. And the two of them have just jointly authored a new report looking specifically at what the major project sector can learn from this recent HS2 cancellation experience. So, Kay and Andy, welcome to the Infrastructure Podcast.
Good morning, Anthony. Very nice to be here.
Thank you, Anthony. Thanks for inviting us.
Great. Well, let's start with you, Andy. Before we get into the whys and what fors, with hindsight, was the decision to cancel HS2 North the right one?
I thought you were going to ask me that one, Anthony. I'm not actually going to answer it. And the reason being, it's not a politician sitting on the fence on this one. So a little bit about the Major Projects Association. So we are a membership organisation. Our members are the firms involved in delivering a lot of this major projects, the infrastructure that you were talking about. But we also have advisory firms, and we have government departments. So it's the 360 degrees, if you like, of organisations involved in major projects. So we're not an industry body. So therefore, we don't really have an opinion on behalf of a sector, because that eclectic mix of different types of organisations may not all necessarily agree on an approach, and particularly where we've got parts of government in membership and others, so we can't offer you an opinion. What we can do is to provide or to reflect the range of perspectives that our members have on these issues, and that's what we set out to find through this producing this report.
So I'll have to turn to you then, Kay. As a former HS2 design director, I suppose disappointed, I'm sure, but were you surprised by this decision?
I think the whole organisation was surprised by the decision. We actually all dialed in to the Conservative Party conference. The silence in the room was palpable to hear the decision that the project had been cancelled. We actually didn't get an instruction on the cancellation till a few months later. Even our chairman admitted that he had only heard the night before that was the case. So we'd heard rumour, but there had always been rumour and speculation around HS2. That was not unusual. I think there were many people who had spent 10 to 15 years of their lives working on the project who were deeply disappointed.
Right. Well, turning to the new report, which is titled Cancellation of Major Projects, Perspective on Rethinking the Approach to Major Projects Inspired from HS2 Phase 2 Lessons. We'll get into a bit of the specifics, but one of the phrases that you use, Kay, is failure. It's about a failure of political process and governance as much as it is a failure of project setup and delivery. So why do you say that?
I think the first thing I just want to clarify, it was not me who's saying this. This is an assimilation of the views of the Major Projects Association from a meeting that we held. But what I would say is that it is well known that major projects, the greatest risk is always political. One of the difficulties with projects of this scale is that they are so large that the stop-start regime around them really does create huge supply chain issues. When you've got 28,000 people working on a project, stopping it and starting it is not as easy as turning off and on a tap. Huge amount of time was invested in the hybrid bill early on. But the process still didn't really capture the need for the public consultation and feed the need for the politicians to feel that their constituencies were happy. And so when we started building and delivering, there was what one might call the kind of the big political issues, but there were also the local community issues to deal with.
A lot of moving parts in a project.
A huge amount of moving parts and over a significant area of the country through many constituencies.
Well, Andy, what do you think? I mean, politics, as we constantly say, is integral to infrastructure. You can't get away from it. The two are really linked. I mean, why was this project different?
Well, the scale that Kay mentioned, I think, is a significant one. But if you look at the politics of it and the political processes involved, Hansard produced a report and they went through all of the parliamentary time of the legislative process for the effectively the 4 hybrid bills that we've had, and it amounted to 1,300 hours of legislative time. Now, to put that into context, over the course of those parliamentary terms, that's about 10% of parliamentary time. So this is massive in terms of the time consumed. And then you've got the select committees and also the statutory bodies, local authorities and so on that are involved as well. So it's not for a lack of political engagement that's the challenge here, but some of the challenges that we have is that where we have, for example, a delay to getting consents, but we don't then think about the impact on the timeline, it then starts to bake in some delivery challenges that we have with it. And I think we'll probably cover this later on, that one of the things that we unpack is the sort of the asymmetry in the political decision-making processes, and that 1,300 hours of parliamentary time to get to yes, and yet 0 hours of parliamentary time to say no.
Well, let's get into that, because turning to the MPA's new report, there are lots of really, really great little nuggets of detail, such as you've just brought up there. So it's well worth a read for sure. But the first point that you make is that the project was vulnerable from escalating costs in the context of government facing fiscal squeeze. I mean, Kay, realistically, was that really avoidable?
I think there were a number of unforeseen circumstances that all projects across the UK have faced. There was COVID, there was the Ukraine war, and there was a huge amount of inflation. So the project was not an outlier in terms of cost increases. And we did have an agreement where everything was benchmarked back to 2019. Mm-hmm. Now, clearly, within that fiscal environment, the government were struggling to meet those costs.
Andy, what would you say? I mean, the government is always under pressure financially, I imagine. I mean, in this case, was this avoidable?
No, in that respect. I mean, if you've got, the largest project with the biggest price tag, even if the increases are explainable, if you have an increase to a very large number, it still then becomes a very large increase. Yeah. Well, and you can't avoid the discussion of affordability. So it's really right that we reevaluate whether a project remains affordable, even if the cost increases are very explainable. Yeah.
But we have problems such as, inflation was really hit the project incredibly hard. It hit all projects incredibly hard. And I suppose that's not something you can necessarily predict at the start of a project.
No, and so that's something that you have to adapt with, or that governments have to address in terms of the balance of the projects that they can fund.
Yeah, I mean, Kay, does that mean just having a bigger contingency at the start?
Well, contingencies were built into the project. I think that there is an issue on these major projects and personal perspective about the allocation of risk and recognising at different points in the project what that risk and allocation is.
Well, let's move on to the report. You highlight opportunities, and then you have some actual solutions to those that you bring up along the way. And I think there's 5 of them. But the second one you point out is around misalignment between project goals and the overarching narrative, speed versus capacity, in effect. I suppose from an outside perspective, Andy, I mean, why would you say this happened, and why was it a problem?
Yes, so HS2 is effectively about a capacity challenge initially, but then also that then brings up regeneration, and then later on, obviously, it was latched onto as the sort of the north-south sort of levelling up agenda. Mm-hmm. But when then you go through the steps to seek approval for funding and going through all of the the consenting and the political processes on the economic side of things, Department for Transport has a well developed and well respected economic appraisal mechanism, TAG, and the way that that's applied to a major project such as HS2 is it drives you towards journey times, and in particular the journey time savings of business travellers or economic travellers.
Yeah.
And so that then starts to influence the solutions you put together that then enhance that economic rating, which isn't necessarily the same as the strategic case, which is about capacity and regeneration. So you've got these sort of not opposing forces, but 2 different forces effectively end up impacting the specification for the railway.
And I think, Andy summarised the issues really well there. There was a sort of constant narrative in the press. This is a very large project that was under attack in some respects, that it was all about saving 15 minutes. So the early narrative did undermine the huge public benefits that the project would have brought.
Right, yeah. The third issue you highlighted is around governance and the creation of a startup, or I suppose you could call it, some would call it a pop-up client, an organisation which is set up just for the purpose of delivering that project. It's not unusual, but why would you say it caused a problem here, Kay?
HS2 was as big as very large government departments, but it had been set up relatively quickly given the scale of delivery across so many constituencies within the UK.
Well, it's been said it's kind of almost like running a FTSE 250 company. It's that kind of scale of business operation you've got going on there. Exactly.
And it was also determined how it developed by different stage points along the way. There's certainly a place for organisations such as, first of all, the National Infrastructure Commission to determine early on which projects should be funded and the benefits to the UK across the piece. And then secondly, for organisations such as the IPA to look across all of the infrastructure projects to ensure that the setup and the delivery and the mechanisms are properly in place. Yeah. And I think those are really important roles that exist in other countries that don't exist here. And it does give you that longevity of a client perspective that runs across very large programmes.
But of course, Andy, as I said, this is not the only project using this kind of pop-up client. You could have an example of the Tideway project, for instance. It's got a very similar sort of organisational structure. What would you say was the problem here?
Well, as you say, it's a well-trodden path. It doesn't necessarily mean that it's the right path.
Right.
And because we've effectively been in the habit of creating these startup or these pop-up clients, as they're sometimes referred to, I think it's right for us to reconsider the impacts of doing so. But essentially, you're building from scratch, from a blank sheet, a corporate capability at the same time as you're building your project capability, at the same time as having to deliver project work. When you just say that out loud, it just feels like a bit of a nonsense that we would do that. And if you put it into corporate context, as Kay said, making it equivalent to, say, a FTSE 250 firm, here we are causing or creating an organisation where there's an inevitable moment of crisis as you transition from one stage of growth to the next. And in a project life cycle, not only are you scaling up in terms of growing from a small number of employees and an extended supply chain and workforce to a very large number, but you also have a life cycle that you move from. So they're really different skill sets, and each transition point is a moment of risk on the project. So I think it's quite right that we reconsider the approach of these, startup organizations, and looking, as Kay said, to other countries where they have sort of delivery agencies where they effectively provide that initiation and mobilization work. It means you can learn lessons from one project to the next, to the next, to the next, rather than having a whole new group of people trying to form relationships and trying to learn as they go along.
The next problem that's highlighted is one of schedule compression caused by a delayed start, leading to what you describe as suboptimal commercial strategy. I mean, essentially, the project failed to manage the commercial capability versus complexity gap. How do you see the problem for HS2, Kay?
I think the amount of time that was taken during the hybrid build process took away from the delivery time. It's absolutely essential that projects of this scale spend time on designing, working out what they're going to do and how they're going to do it. When that gets compressed, the project is pushed into a position of going perhaps when it's not ready to go.
Right.
So we were also under pressure because of the timelines for the acquisition of the land. So there were a whole series of deadlines that meant things that were happening more quickly than they should have normally happened. The deadlines should have been extended to allow that to occur.
So you're starting later and being pressed to finish either earlier or at least on the original schedule date. You've got less time to deliver essentially the same amount of stuff.
And the time to design is one of the essential parts of delivering a project well. It's the route way to good delivery.
Because Andy, constantly the MPA makes the point that work done at the start basically reaps benefits at the end.
And just to add to Kay's points, that in terms of the, as you say, the lessons on schedule compression. So there's an organisation called Independent Project Analysis. They work mostly in oil and gas. They've got, I think, their benchmarking that they do on should cost and should take in terms of time scale, and then looking at the performance of industrial projects. One of the conclusions that they make and they offer as advice in their guidance is a project will take the time that you originally estimate it will take, and you can't compress that schedule.
Right.
So their lessons is it just cannot be done. So if your original view is it's going to be an 8-year project, it will be an 8-year project, and nothing ever compresses it. It will always end up taking that or longer, in spite of every measure you take to try and compress it. So I think it's just something that we need to be really blunt with in terms of, with politicians, with ministers, with the public at large, that when you have a 2-year delay or whatever it would be, that you need to then shuffle everything along so you don't compress the schedule, because it will take that time anyway.
So that's pretty much the diagnosis. Let's get on to, I think you make 4 recommendations in the report. But before that, it's always for the genesis of this report. Why did you put it together, and how did it go about?
Yeah, so with that caveat right at the beginning, that we don't have an opinion, but being the Major Projects Association, it doesn't mean to say we should remain silent. And it's really important that we learn lessons from one project to the next. That's why we exist, and that's why we thought it was very important, given that it's the biggest project being undertaken in the UK, that it had the impact of a big part of it being cancelled, had the negative coverage in terms of what remains, is it worthwhile, and so on. So it was really important for us to really think about what are the lessons from that, because if we want to minimise the likelihood of a project being cancelled. That's just about making it a good project in the first place, really, and addressing some of those things that are unique to major projects. This won't be the last project that gets cancelled. There will be others. So how do we minimise the impacts? So we did want to understand what the impacts were. And then once you understand the impacts, then these 4 recommendations or these 4 ideas come up about how we can reduce the likelihood and we can reduce the impacts should a project be cancelled.
Well, Kay, I mean, obviously arguably, you're giving a perspective from having been on the inside because you stood down as HS2 design director in May. But you're no stranger to major projects. You worked on the Olympics in 2012, the Foreign and Commonwealth Office of State, and briefly you worked on Crossrail. And you've also recently been working with Sadie Morgan to establish the National Infrastructure Commission Design Group. How do you describe your role when putting together this report?
Firstly, as an MPA board member, there was a certain amount of uncertainty about projects being cancelled at this scale that affects all sectors and investment capacity. So it was important that we looked at that. From my perspective, it's really important that we spend public money well, and that we do not spend money on projects that are cancelled and therefore the public don't receive the benefits of them. Design is about the route way to delivery. It's not about the aesthetics and what things look like. And I think it has a central part to play. And getting the design right gives you a certainty of what you're buying when you go to construction.
Right. What are you up to now, by the way?
I've been taking a really great break, a step back, having a look at what's happening at the moment. And I'm very interested in what this government are currently trying to do. So I'm standing back and taking a good hard look.
Well, there's arguably plenty of opportunity because there's no shortage of ambition from this current government in terms of infrastructure. So let's talk about the report's recommendations. There's 4 of them in the main. Let's start, Andy, with the first one, which is update the Green Book and related investment appraisal methodologies to better enable the wider benefits to be recognised over a longer time frame. I mean, what needs to happen in your view?
So Green Book has been updated and it's under continual review. So our recommendations were a point in time, back in January of 2024, and we just really wanted to put a marker, from particularly those who were represented in the discussion, that there's an opportunity here to apply the lessons from here so we don't have a repeat of this in the future. And I think it sort of builds on some prior recommendations in this space too. So it'd be great if we can have, perhaps a deeper look and just really challenge some of those current practices and say, are they still fit for the needs of our projects today?
So plenty of work for the new government to get stuck into there for sure. Second one, Kay, is that it says projects should have inbuilt schedule relief or fire breaks. What do you mean by that, and why do you say that?
So HS2 is approved in stages through individual hybrid bills, but the business case makes most sense for the whole of the route. We believe that if there'd been a different partitioning strategy, for example, Manchester to Birmingham or Crewe to Birmingham as the first leg, it could have delivered more value for money. It could have also been tested on a smaller part of the line to optimise the delivery.
Right. So started in the wrong place, essentially.
I'm not saying that they started in the wrong place. I'm just saying that there is the opportunity to start small, test,
right,
and then roll out a bigger programme is one that I think has merit.
Okay.
Yeah, and Angela, can I come in on this as well? I mean, we held the MPA, we held a seminar earlier in the year about what can major projects learn from, say, technology projects that use agile techniques, sort of incrementive and iterative approaches. One of the things that came out of that is the concept of things like off-ramps, so giving us the options to stop,
right,
where actually at these point in times we can say, if we go no further, what we've delivered to date, will be of value, and that's not necessarily been the case when you sort of end up being it's too big to cancel or it's too big to stop. Say the decision making could be quite different if you'd planned those options in and given the politicians those options because they're designed in from the beginning.
Okay.
And I think I'd also like to add from a personal perspective that Phase 2A from Birmingham to Crewe was a very critical part of the line on a over-congested West Coast railway. And it was also the phase where we had learnt a huge number of lessons from Phase 1 in terms of optimising the delivery, looking at standardisation for viaducts, etc. So the opportunities and the refinement were beginning to flow through the programme. We just didn't have the opportunity to deliver them.
Okay, the third recommendation you talk about is to consider the merits of establishing a national infrastructure delivery agency, which it sounds challenging, Andy. How might it work?
Yeah, so this is a model used elsewhere. So the US Army Corps of Engineers provide that capability for US infrastructure. You have an equivalent organisation in the Netherlands. So it's a name I can't pronounce, but there it exists. The French do it as well. And I think Denmark has been applying that approach. So this is to counter the challenge of the startup or the pop-up client where you're, as mentioned before, that you're delivering corporate capability and project capability whilst you're doing project work. So that's the idea. So could we have an agency that would do all these startup initiation and mobilization activity, for all of our major projects that perhaps, not all, but perhaps projects that hit certain triggers or needs. So that's the idea. Interestingly, since we had this discussion and that idea was proposed, we have the NISTA discussion going on, the National Infrastructure and Service Transformation Authority by the Starmer government. The devil will be in the detail of that one, which is proposing to bring the National Infrastructure Commission and the Infrastructure and Projects Authority together into a single body. What the remit of that new organisation would be, and would it have some of this delivery agency capability? I think something we will look to see, but that then possibly opens up a discussion around is that overarching organisation doing too much, and might it be separate, better formed in a slightly different way?
Well, as you say, the devil will be definitely in the detail around that one. Well, which brings us to number 4, which you say Parliament should vote on a long-term national infrastructure strategy developed by the National Infrastructure Commission with a 30 to 100-year view. And that means that the NIC would become a statutory body. I mean, Kay, how do you see that happening in reality?
I think what we were considering was whether, rather than just making recommendations for the government to accept, that they actually set up a programme of national infrastructure based on the imperatives of the criticality of it, and that they took a much longer view, removing some of the decision making from the shorter term political issues. So taking a 30-year to 100-year view in the same way that many other countries do.
Yeah. But actually locking that in by Parliament voting on it and saying this is what we're going to do.
Yeah, being approved by Parliament via legislation and then setting out what those projects require in terms of funding. Yeah. So giving that kind of long duration and consideration, and then also to perform a role in guiding decision-making on planning and consenting.
Yeah. And also you say, Andy, that the IPA, the Infrastructure and Projects Authority, should provide an induction briefing scheme on major projects for MPs, ministers and mayors, presumably to allow them to have a decent view on the decisions they're going to be asked to make.
So the sort of opportunity around the is really around addressing that asymmetry issue that we discussed earlier, but also in terms of the impact of politics on projects. And the point being is, major projects by the definition are political decisions. Yeah. So there will be people who gain and people who lose over any infrastructure or major project. So the politicians at every level, whether that's local authorities, regional governments or the national government do need to be involved. So that idea of an induction is things like the schedule compression we discussed earlier. If ministers and shadow ministers and politicians at all levels are more aware of the impact of decision making, the impact of delay, then their expectations will be far better met if they understand that 18-month delay means an 18-month delay to the end point as well. So
well, that brings me, I suppose, just to round up. We're talking about sort of the post-election, post-general election politics. Do you think we're in a better political place post-election? Does the Labour administration have a better understanding of the world of major projects than perhaps the previous administration did?
There did appear to be a lot of consultation that went on ahead of the general election, and then ideas such as the NISTA proposal came out from that. I think we need to see what comes out of the October budget, really, in terms of what gets put forward, because we are seeing that those fiscal challenges that led to the decision to cancel Phase 2A haven't gone away. No. So there's been some yo-yoing in terms of, for example, whether the Euston leg would be privately funded or whether that was non-viable, so therefore needs to be publicly funded. But it's in neither of those at the moment. So will that come out in the October budget? So I think we need to see what really comes out of these proposals and how they're set out. But
as we discussed recently with Mark Farmer, just having a target of 1.5 million homes built over a parliament doesn't necessarily get them built. Okay, from a designer's perspective, are we likely to therefore see the next major project delivered better as a result of this cancellation?
There are some really strong recommendations in the report which could bring benefits. From my personal perspective, I think that one of the critical issues is the allocation of risk resting with the party most able to bear the risk. Around issues such as planning and the politics, that needs to be a sort of government side body that manages those. When it comes to the construction and the delivery, it obviously needs to be the construction parties, and in between that sits design, which kind of shapes part of the project. So a more considered view on the allocation of risk, sitting with the right parties rather than just allocating risk to other people in the assumption that will reap benefits and will make it easier, is not the right way to go.
But as a positive note to end on, I hope you both would agree that the UK is still able to deliver major projects.
I do. And one thing, just to follow up on your sort of previous question as well, there's a lot of good know-how already in place about how to do major projects well. The Infrastructure and Projects Authority have their suite of guidance, including things such as the project initiation route map to guide departments and agencies and client bodies through the early stages of projects into delivery. So there's a lot of good guidance and practice out there, including things such as the Major Projects Leadership Academy. So we're doing lots of the right things in this area, but there does sometimes come a point where perhaps some of those good practices are challenged.
Yeah, sorry, Kay.
Yeah, so I just wanted to add, we have been talking very much about the kind of failure of HS2, but I think I really need to underscore here the scale of the project and the immense achievements that the project has managed. I mean, it has delivered hybrid bills, it has delivered construction on site, it's looked at 3 phases all at once, doing everything all at once. And even now, with just phase 1, this is the biggest infrastructure project that the UK has ever undertaken. You cannot underestimate how large the programme is, and actually to go out on site really brings it home what a massive project this is. And we must all remember that Crossrail was castigated for being late, but once it was delivered and everybody experienced it, it's now used as it's the most used railway in the UK. Phase 1 of HS2 has the potential to also capture that public imagination and use.
Okay, that's a fantastically positive way to end the discussion. We've all got time for today, unfortunately. Thanks so much for joining me on the Infrastructure Podcast today. Very interesting discussion. I believe I'll put a link to the report in the show notes. I think it's accessible via the MPA website.
It will be, and also worth putting a link to a talk that was given by Professor Ben Ansell, because we've been talking about politics. So he gave us a talk at our Prestige event in June about the politics of projects. So so comparing some of those approaches of other countries and so on.
There's certainly no shortage of information out there to help the industry to deliver much better. So thanks so much, Kay and Andy, for joining me today.
Thank you, Anthony. Pleasure to meet you.
Good. Well, that's all we've got time for today, but we've got more from the Infrastructure Podcast in the pipeline and more guests to talk to as we continue to probe the big issues faced across the sector. If you haven't done so already, do check out the new Infrastructure Podcast website, www.infrastructure-podcast.com, where you'll find background information and all the latest podcasts to listen to and to share. So thanks for joining us. Thanks again to Andy and to Kay. I look forward to seeing you again very soon.